To understand how a man could sign 231 death sentences and never spend a night in prison, you have to go back to where the machine was built. Adolf Hitler has been in power for a year. He has the police, he has the press, but he has a problem: German courts. Real ones, with real judges, occasionally acquit people, occasionally follow the law instead of the Führer. The breaking point came in 1933, during the trial over the Reichstag fire. Germany's existing Supreme Court, the Volksgerichtshof, convicted the man found at the scene, but acquitted his supposed co-conspirators for lack of evidence. Hitler was furious. A court that could still say, "not proven," wasn't a court he could use. His solution wasn't to abolish the courts. It was smarter than that. He built a new one, the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, created by decree in April 1934, on paper, a court like any other, in practice, a weapon with a bench and a gavel. And the regime didn't stop at building one new court. It rewrote the rules for every court in the country. In 1935, the Penal Code was amended to let judges convict, based on gesundes Volksempfinden, sound popular judgment, rather than the letter of any written statute. In practice, that meant a judge no longer needed a law on the books to send someone to prison or the gallows. He needed only to decide what the Führer himself would have wanted. Freisler said as much, openly, on the record. A verdict was sound if it matched what Hitler would have ruled. By 1942, the People's Court had a president who understood exactly what it was for: Roland Freisler. He didn't invent the court. Otto Georg Thierack had run it before him, before being promoted to Reich Minister of Justice, and by his own account, handing his successor an institution designed to make the administration of law answer directly to political leadership. Freisler simply perfected it. A man who screamed at defendants instead of questioning them, who wore a blood-red robe, who once told a woman on trial that she was vermin before her verdict was even read. Freisler's court had one real job: not justice, conviction. And the numbers prove it wasn't subtle. In the People's Court's early years, roughly 5% of cases ended in a death sentence. Under Freisler, that figure climbed to 46%. Nearly 1 in every 2 people who stood in front of him left in a coffin, or on the way to one. But here's the twist almost nobody expects. Freisler is not the villain of this story. Freisler never faced a courtroom of his own. On February 3, 1945, an American bombing raid hit the courthouse in Berlin. Freisler was killed instantly, according to the accounts that survive him, still holding the file of the next man he was about to sentence. Justice, if you want to call it that, arrived for Roland Freisler by accident, from the sky, before the war even ended. The men who worked under him didn't get bombed. They went home. One of them was a mid-level judge named Hans-Joachim Rehse. Rehse wasn't the showman Freisler was. No red robes, no screaming. He was the type of man juries trust: quiet, methodical, precise. From 1941 to 1945, he sat on 373 cases at the People's Court. 231 of them ended in death. Look at who those death sentences were for, and the word justice starts to feel obscene. A comedian, executed for cracking private jokes about Hitler. A priest, executed for the same. A country doctor, sentenced to death, not for a crime you'd recognize as one, but for telling a pregnant patient she was brave to be having a baby in the 5th year of the war. A comment. A sentence in a private conversation. That's what put a rope around a doctor's neck. Rehse signed off on all of it. And when the war ended, he did something almost nobody expects a man like that to do. He didn't run. He didn't hide in a farmhouse hole like some men we could name. He went home to West Germany with his wife and daughter, and he waited. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely make you angry. In 1956, 11 years after the war, 11 years after 231 people died on his signature, Hans-Joachim Rehse won a judgeship, a real one. In the state court of Schleswig-Holstein, a man who had sentenced a doctor to death for one sentence to a patient was, once again, wearing the robe and deciding the fates of ordinary Germans. He lasted 11 months before his past caught up with him, and he was quietly removed. But think about what that 11 months means, and think about the pool he was drawn from. When the occupying powers tried to rebuild German courts after 1945, they discovered a brutal staffing problem. Well over 90% of all judges and prosecutors in the country had belonged to the Nazi Party. In the American zone, officials tried to keep a bare 5% of judgeships free of former party members and struggled even to hit that number. Some regional reports from the late 1940s found 60 to 70% of sitting judges and prosecutors were ex-members, with over half the nominees for one state's Supreme Court carrying the same history. Denazification, as a serious project, effectively ended within 2 or 3 years of the war's close, replaced by what officials at the time called democratization, a softer word for the same old faces staying in the same old chairs. Against that backdrop, Rehse's 11 months on the bench isn't an anomaly. It's the system working exactly as it was quietly rebuilt to work. It means for 11 months, nobody checked, or nobody cared to. And Rehse wasn't unique, not even close. Investigators would later find that at least 29 former People's Court judges and 69 former prosecutors from that same court went on to hold positions in the West German judiciary after the war. Men who had built careers sending people to the guillotine were now deciding traffic disputes, custody cases, contract law. Some of them didn't even need to hide it. They just went back to work. And it wasn't only the courts. Inside West Germany's own justice ministry, the institution meant to be a bulwark of the new democratic rule of law, former Nazi lawyers filled senior positions for years. By 1958, historians have found virtually everyone ever convicted of a Nazi-era crime in West Germany had already been pardoned. By the early 1960s, pressure was building. The Eichmann trial in Jerusalem had put Nazi crimes back on the front page of every newspaper in the world. West Germany, embarrassed, started looking harder at its own untouched war criminals, a slow, halting process that had actually begun a few years earlier, in 1958, with the Einsatzkommando trial, the first major Nazi crimes case ever heard under ordinary German law rather than by an allied or international tribunal. 10 former SS men were convicted there for murders in Lithuania. It was a start. It was also, tellingly, aimed at soldiers and policemen in the field, not at the judges who had signed paperwork from behind a bench. Rehse's name came up. Authorities in Schleswig-Holstein opened an investigation in 1962. In February 1966, they arrested him. His defense was simple, and it's the defense that echoes through this entire story. I didn't make the laws, I just applied them. A Berlin court didn't buy it entirely. In 1966, Rehse was convicted as an accessory to what the court called legal murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison. 5 years for 231 deaths. Already, to most people watching, that math didn't work. But it gets worse. Rehse appealed. And the Federal Supreme Court in Karlsruhe, West Germany's highest court, agreed to hear it. Their ruling wasn't what anyone expected. The judges in Karlsruhe didn't say the sentence was too light. They said it made no logical sense at all. Either Rehse was fully responsible for what he'd done, they argued, or he was fully innocent. 5 years was a compromise verdict, and compromise, they said, wasn't how the law worked. They sent it back for a full retrial. Here's where the real weapon in this story gets pulled out. A legal doctrine invented back in 1946, quietly, almost unnoticed, called the Richterprivileg, judicial privilege. Under this doctrine, a judge could only be held criminally responsible for a verdict if it could be proven he had knowingly and deliberately twisted a law he understood to be different. Not that the verdict was monstrous, not that a doctor died for a sentence to a patient. Only whether Rehse, personally, believed at the time that what he was doing was legal, and under Nazi law, a legal code that let judges execute people for jokes, what Rehse did, technically, was legal. The trap was built, and it was built years before Rehse ever walked back into that courtroom. July 1968, the retrial concludes. Judge Ernst Jürgen Oske, a man only 42 years old, with no Nazi past of his own, a judge trained entirely after the war, reads the verdict, not guilty. Oski's reasoning was almost clinical. Rehse and his fellow judges, he said, hadn't deliberately subverted the law as it existed at the time. The sentences were inhuman as seen today, his words. But Germany, he said, had been in a life-and-death struggle, and no nation fights a war like that with normal legal restraint. Read that sentence again. A West German judge in 1968 arguing that wartime justifies executing a doctor for a comment to a pregnant patient. That's the moment the courtroom erupted. That's the slap across the face. That's the 7,000 students on the Kurfürstendamm. Oski himself didn't walk away unscathed. The backlash was so intense that days later he suffered a nervous breakdown. But Rehse walked out of that building a free man. And here's the sentence that should stop you cold. After his acquittal, every other pending case against a People's Court judge, every single one, was dropped. Not for a year, not for 5 years, for over a decade. You'd think, after a scandal that big, West Germany would come back stronger. It didn't, not for a long time. Investigations into Nazi-era judges didn't resume in earnest until 1979, more than a decade later, and when prosecutors finally tried again, they ran into a new problem. Take Paul Reimers. In the 1980s, at 82 years old, he was indicted on 97 counts, 97 unjustified death sentences handed down from the same court Rehse had served on. Prosecutors built an 875-page case, 5 years of work, 6,000 pages of documents pulled from East German archives that had only just become available. Reimers never answered for a single one of them. Days before the indictment became public, he vanished. Him, his wife, their 19-year-old son. Gone from their home in Bremen, rumors placed him in a country with no extradition treaty. As insurance, he reportedly had a doctor's certificate ready, declaring him unfit to stand trial, just in case anyone ever caught up with him. Nobody ever did. By the time the dust settled on this entire chapter of German legal history, one number stood above all the others, and it's the number that should end this video and doesn't, because there's more still to say. Not a single judge who served on the People's Court was ever successfully prosecuted by West Germany. Not one. And zoom out even further, past the People's Court alone, to every lawyer and judge across the entire Reich who had helped design and carry out the Nazi legal program, the special courts, the racial laws, the whole apparatus. Researchers who have combed the post-war record count only 2 convictions, in total, of jurists for building that machine. 2, against a legal profession that numbered in the tens of thousands. Compare that to how East Germany handled the same question. In the Soviet-controlled zone, denazification of the judiciary was far more absolute. Unqualified but politically reliable laypeople were installed as judges instead of tainted professionals. By 1948, 4 former People's Court judges and prosecutors in Soviet-administered territory were already serving prison terms. Eventually, 5 members of the People's Court faced justice under the East German system, including Wilhelm Klitsky, who was sentenced to death. It's a grim irony of the Cold War that the authoritarian half of Germany prosecuted Hitler's judges more seriously and more quickly than the democracy built to replace them. So how many people actually died because of this court? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody has an exact number, and that's not an accident. Records were destroyed deliberately in the final chaotic months of the war. Files burned, archives scattered, evidence buried along with the bodies. What historians have been able to reconstruct puts the People's Court's own death sentences somewhere around 5,000. But the People's Court didn't operate alone. It sat at the top of an entire pyramid of Nazi special courts across Germany, courts that took their cues from Freisler's bench and multiplied the same logic in every regional capital in the Reich. When you add what those courts did in the People's Court's name and in its shadow, historians who've spent careers on this era put the combined toll well into the thousands upon thousands, a number that, depending on how you draw the line, comfortably clears 10,000 lives. 10,000 people sentenced to death, often for words, not actions. And the men who signed those sentences, the ones who lived to see 1945, went home to pensions, to law offices, to judgeships. Some of them lived into their 80s. Rehse himself died in 1969, 1 year after his acquittal, at his home, not in a cell. You'd like to think this story is over. It isn't. Historians are still finding case files today, boxes in regional archives, misfiled decades ago, that turn out to be verdicts nobody has read since the war. Every few years, a name surfaces that nobody had connected to the People's Court before. A retired notary, a small-town lawyer, a man who spent 40 quiet years 2 streets from a courthouse where he once, as a young clerk, watched a death sentence get signed and said nothing. And there's a detail that almost never makes it into the history books, but should. Some of the judges who staffed those post-war courts, the ones deciding, decades later, whether men like Rehse deserved punishment, had themselves come up through a legal system still shaped by the very doctrines the Nazis had used. The line between the old guard and the new Germany was a lot blurrier and a lot slower to fade than anyone wanted to admit in public. Even the German state itself took its time admitting what the People's Court actually was. It wasn't until 1985, 40 years after the war ended, 17 years after Rehse walked free, that the West German Bundestag formally declared the Volksgerichtshof an instrument of state-sanctioned terror, whose sole purpose had been the destruction of political opponents behind a juridical facade. And the verdicts themselves, the 231 death sentences Rehse signed, the tens of thousands handed down across the whole system, weren't formally wiped off the books until 1998, when a federal law finally annulled every judgment the People's Court had ever issued. 53 years after the court stopped existing, Germany's parliament was still doing the paperwork to say, officially, that none of it had ever been justice at all. That's the real ending of this story. Not a verdict, not a villain finally caught. A quiet, unfinished list of names, some of them still being added to, decades after the war, that was supposed to have settled the question of what these men deserved. Roland Freisler died in the rubble of the court he built. Hans-Joachim Rehse died in his own bed, a free man, 1 year after a courtroom full of strangers screamed shame in his face, and it changed nothing. That's not a footnote to this story. That's the story.